Surprise of the century, it turns out we don't only play Souls-like games over here at the DevBox offices, which is to say down in the bunker buried deep below the Pacific Northwest. Well, now we're here to expand that zone of interest to a new title from the world of one of my favorite time-sync base builders from the last few years. Astroneer and System Era's upcoming new game, Starseeker. The whole title is Starseeker Astroneer Expeditions, but I'm not working in games journalism anymore, so no need to use the full legal name every single time. After playing the most recent beta, I'm really excited for the future of the game, and honestly I want to share that excitement with y'all today. Howdy, I'm Prakuza, and welcome to DevBox, where today I want to go over why you should be excited about Starseeker. Before we get into Starseeker specifically, let's do a quick rundown of Astroneer. Now, there's a decent chance you've seen the game here on YouTube before. It was a fairly popular title for videos a while back, mostly because of the ways that the game's physics and multiplayer can lead to some pretty hilarious outcomes, combined with the cute cartoony art style. Although I have to say, the game is so much more than the surface level you may have seen online. In fact, if you haven't played that game, especially with friends, then consider this video a combination why you should play Astroneer with the excitement for Starseeker. Because while the game starts out like any Minecraft-like explorative crafting game, the twists and turns that Astroneer throws into the mix, from different biomes being located on different planets that need to be flown to, all the way to the satisfactory style of automation that can be put together with railways, auto miners, crane arms. In fact, there's a dead script kicking around on my PC somewhere for a video essay about automation, with this game at the center of that thought process. But without getting into the weeds on Astroneer itself, it's a cutesy base builder with a large, explorable world that opens up for a lot of emergent gameplay moments, like getting caught by a hazard or digging down and finding a cave to fall and die in. It's great and better with friends. So, with the groundwork built up, how does Starseeker hold up against Astroneer? Well, the beta is different. While this obviously comes down to the fact that Astroneer was a base builder and Starseeker is an extraction type game, also real quick, it is so hard to figure out what the genre tag of this should be, because so many extraction games are extraction shooters, but this isn't a shooter, and so casual extraction adventure is kind of breaking my brain. What do we call this thing? Anyway, the genres are clearly very different, even if the basic tools of the player are very similar across both games. While heading out on excavations to find materials and map the surrounding areas was absolutely part of the experience back in the original Astroneer, Starseeker really pushes that exploration concept much further. However, before we get entirely into the emergent gameplay that comes with that feeling of endless discovery, I should note a few parts of the initial beta experience that are very much part of the beta test vibe. First off, the beta I participated in was specifically meant to stress test the servers, as this is an entirely online game, with interactions with other players being a part of that experience. So, naturally, there were some issues that we ran into while playing, some of which I hope to be beta-only problems, but I've played plenty of games during their beta phases, or in early access, that the hope of the version 1.0 smoothing off all of those rough edges isn't always something that comes true. For the most part, these issues came down mostly to the server stability. There was a lot of stuttering, difficulty starting and returning from individual expeditions, and the most damning has got to be the way that some inputs are either delayed or eaten due to connection issues. This was especially rough during combat, as each fight against the creature ends with holding the interact button. On PlayStation it was square, so I assume probably E or F on keyboard. But if that input gets either delayed or eaten, then it forces us to wear the creature down all over again. Super annoying and almost made combat not worth it for most of the beta. Which is a shame, because when you get the hang of it, combat encounters feel like Breath of the Wild without a weapon. I mean, who doesn't want to fight boghounds by throwing carrotlings at them until they drop? Some of that won't make sense to y'all yet, but in Minecraft terms, imagine killing an Enderman by throwing chickens at it on repeat. Aside from the less than stable servers, the beta otherwise feels like a very clean experience, though the loss of the content being held back until release can certainly be felt. There's a solid backbone here, but it can get repetitive fast, and mechanical progression ends quickly. That being said, we got some hints at what some of that content to come will be. New nozzles we otherwise don't have access to, upgrades to our mods, and possibly even hints at a potential upgrade for the backpack, and gadgets like the tranquilizing canister that pretty much trivializes combat entirely. Interestingly enough, the beta also gave us a surprising amount of freedom to explore the starting planet of Tephra, with some folks having even discovered and explored the second biome, Tangle, before we'd unlocked it as a group after the first couple of days. I'll go over some of my further discoveries later on in the video, but I can guarantee that System Era did not expect us to check out all of these locations. So the beta had its troubles, but I overall had fun and enough to do to keep me and my partner for the experience, Vi, or Violent Hippie as you'll see in a lot of the footage, entertained for the entire beta period. As a very mission-oriented player myself, that is absolutely a compliment for me, given that I'd completed all the missions long before our time with the game had even ended. So, to go over the two areas that System Era expected us to explore, we had two biomes across Tephra that we could freely navigate throughout the beta test. First was the wetlands, a mostly safe location with a handful of basic flora and even some simple fauna that isn't too difficult to deal with. Although some of the native creatures can absolutely rip us apart if we aren't prepared to fight a handful of them at once. The initial location gives us a little room to breathe and gets our bearings on how exploration is going to work on each expedition. I will say though that not all that glitters is gold here, as some aspects of both exploration and mission progress is hampered a bit by some of the game's systems. For instance, a decent amount of missions and tasks are centered around the major landmarks of the game, including the Sinkhole, the Spire, and Orphan Island. But most importantly is the Elysium Bridge, a crashed ship in the center of the map that houses access to powerful healing materials and a handful of locked exo chests that could hold some great mods and multi-tool nozzles. With these places being so important, it can be pretty annoying to land on the other end of the biome from each of these locations, especially when you've got a mission for something that is now going to take you 10 of the allotted 30 minutes in a run to reach before having to hunt down materials or solve some puzzle when you get there. Altogether, it's a minor critique though, as some of our later exploration would quickly show that it's entirely possible to circle the entire planet over the course of a single expedition. Otherwise, Tephra is nearly a one-to-one match to Sylvia, but with more active hazards and a more randomized set of materials to carve out of the planet. After about a day and a half in the beta, the player base all worked together to turn in task tokens by completing tasks, or side quests, in order to unlock a second biome, Tangle. We're still on Tephra here, but the variety is wildly different from the initial wetlands. That's notable immediately with the color scheme of the biome, as well as the shape of the terrain, with pillars that upholds a high road that can be used to traverse the area fairly quickly and relatively safely. As long as you don't run into a pit pedal and fall to your death, that is. However, the biggest difference is in the flora and fauna that appear in Tangle, including new plants like the pigment and goop pods, but also new enemies like the sputers and ghost tails, both of which are much more dangerous than the boghounds and brutaloths found in wetlands. Oh, but don't worry, the boghounds are also still hanging around, and they will catch you if you're walking around in their territory and slam you down quickly. With these two different biomes, there are tons of landmarks to discover, tasks to accomplish, missions given out by the main three quest givers, and random, interactable mechanics that creates quite a bit of emergent gameplay moments. At least I don't think the devs planned for us to dive into boghound nests, steal their eggs, and then taunt them with their stolen babies, only to glide away to safety without them ever getting a chance to defend themselves. With that, let's get into the actual gameplay, which comes in three forms: discovery, collection, and combat. First up, we've already talked about the locations to explore, but the sense of discovery while exploring can keep each biome feeling fresh for a handful of runs. Of course, when you spend a weekend jumping into wetlands over and over, it can be pretty easy to get comfortable enough with the locale that the novelty does eventually wear off. Still, those first couple of runs diving into a new biome and finding new landmarks to scan and uncovering the multi-layered layouts is about the same thrill as first visiting a new planet in the original Astroneer. For the first 10-ish hours, it's a better feeling of discovery than maybe No Man's Sky, but things do start to get repetitive eventually. The next aspect of gameplay is running around each biome and collecting material. This includes minerals that can be dug out of the ground, exactly the same as in Astroneer. However, even more prominent than the minerals are the interactable plants like life fruits that can be harvested for materials. There weren't much use for a lot of these in the beta, outside of some mission turn-ins and maybe being sold for the organic materials, so they don't really leave the biggest impression from this encounter with them. Although it does look like a handful will start getting used on crafting gadgets and such, but rarely the useful ones. What does make collection interesting, however, comes from the flora that generally requires some unique interactions in order to give up their fruit. Like brine apples that need to be watered in order to open, spindles which need edible fruit in order to offer their own fruit in exchange, or the carnivorous Venus flytrap type plants that eat creature parts and give back a unique creature part from something they'd previously eaten. It's cool and requires either some hunting or pre-planning in order to gather a nice collection of these materials. At the moment, a lot of this was in service of missions and tasks, but hopefully there will be some extra reason to actively engage with these mechanics in the future. Alright, and now we're finally talking about the combat, the thing that might actually get some attention from my normal Souls-like audience. Because it's, difficult, and there's, a dodge roll? And stamina management. So yeah, totally Souls-like combat. You know, if you squint. Anyway, combat is very different from most games I've played. Like I mentioned before, it most notably relates to playing Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, but only having access to items to throw instead of an actual sword to swing around. Because instead of relying on a more classic set of combat mechanics like press button to punch or swing a weapon, we need to find objects in the field and throw them at enemies. This can include anything from plant parts to other creatures, but usually is best reserved for stuff like the heavy metal blocks that can be found throughout each biome. They're very common around landing pads, and grabbing a stack of them before exploring can save your skin if you run into trouble. That being said, combat is really only possible when the numbers game is either even or in the player's favor. Because the second the creatures start to outnumber the players, even tilting the scales to a 3-on-2 can quickly spiral into death, which isn't the worst, but it can mean breaking some of your gear. So you definitely want to avoid this as much as possible. One thing that does switch up combat is equipping an offensive nozzle, like the terrain or hose nozzle, both of which can attack enemies from range and slowly deal damage to them. In fact, this leads directly to the best way by far to actually deal with most creatures, and that is to wait somewhere that they can't attack, like in deep water where the player starts swimming, and then spamming them with the water nozzle in the safety of the water. It's cheesy as hell, and to be honest, actually fighting some of the creatures like the Brutaloths is certainly more fun than cheesing from offshore, but given that the worst bug in the beta was related to combat, it became the only option at a certain point. This is because in order to defeat an enemy creature, the player needs to use some method of filling a type of posture or stamina meter over its health, and then follow that up by holding the interact button in order to sedate it permanently. This will allow players to reap the rewards from the fight and remove the danger from the field. However, as easy as this system should be, it only works maybe a quarter of the time at the moment, as the hold prompts were all incredibly buggy during the beta. It's the largest critique I have on the experience, to be honest, and one fight against a boghound, which should be a quick, simple encounter, became a 10-minute ordeal of struggling with the sedate trigger and having to keep knocking the same creature out over and over. So eventually, when the game continues to not reward us for our proper playing procedure, it's pretty easy to take the optimal path that uses the least resources and simply hose everything down from the water. Altogether, the gameplay is certainly enough to keep the game fun and make each run at least somewhat unique from one dive into each biome after the next. That all being said, the stuff that makes me the most excited for when Starseeker actually launches isn't what was shown, but what wasn't. Or at least what wasn't focused on. It started with some little adventures to explore the larger planet of Tephra, like hunting down the billboard that is already marked on the map, even though there's nothing to do there. However, this expanded to exploring the entirety of the underwater biomes that can be explored. Though we don't have most of the tools needed to really stay down here for extended periods, in the water we can find rare materials like cobalite, which I only ever found out here on the ocean floor, and there's even a transit system for keeping players alive under the waves and helping us to traverse quickly from one section of the underwater area to the next. None of this was focused on during the beta, mind you, and there was no implicit reason to come here aside from scratching that itch of exploration. But what we found here was some incredible sights, like this eel cave that gave us this awesome star shell thing. This actually turned out to be Vi's favorite find of the weekend. Personally, I preferred the shell we found on top of this spiral locale nearby, because it reminds me of the prism shell from Chrono Trigger or Cross. Hard to beat, you know? Aside from the plethora of underwater locales, our further explorations across the parts of Tephra we weren't told to go included another island with some boghounds hanging out on top of a high dive, but also an area that reminded me a lot of Glacio from the original game, with these icy mountains with a whole world of materials and interactions to be found by traveling below the surface. Even the trip down was familiar, as it was less like a cave system and appeared more similar to taking the massive gravestones off the side of mountains in Elden Ring. I really like this because it kind of gives us a way down without a real certain way back up to the top. Of course, you can always dig your way back up if you have the patience for that though. The final of these off the beaten path locations, however, is probably my favorite: the Poison Death Cloud area. We can see it on the map of Tephra when we load into either wetlands or Tangle, especially when checking between the two locations, and it quickly kills us if we try to head inside at the moment. I'm guessing we'll get some sort of mod that makes it explorable in the future. However, what I really love about this place is that while some of the other places are pretty barren and missing what will eventually make them interesting, this place is pretty much entirely unfinished. Hence the stay away or die gas clouds that coats the entire place. This is the most you were not supposed to come here place in the entire beta, and I am so happy that I came here. I love seeing this kind of thing in early access, where the facade of the nicely presented zoom in that the developers had planned to present fades away, and we see that the game is in fact still being built and is not quite finished yet. Placeholder plants, the boghounds scattered in half of the other biomes, and the lack of unique plants from one place to another, it's a better showcase of what the devs have planned versus what they have implemented than any roadmap will try to show. I can see the ideas, I can see the work that needs to be put in to finish implementation, but that means that there will be so much more to discover when we do get to that final launch of the game. Alright, I've been glazing for long enough, but yeah, this quick look at what is to come in Starseeker has me pretty excited. I would absolutely suggest that you wishlist the game on Steam, since that's one of the best ways to help games that are still on their way out, and I want to help this game all I can. There's definitely some work to be done between now and release, which is actually coming up very soon, as Starseeker is planning to open into early access on June 11th. In fact, if you're watching this in the first couple of days this video goes live, then System Era is holding another open beta on June 5th and 6th as a network test in preparation for that early access launch. And if you haven't checked out one of the previous beta tests, then I thoroughly encourage you to check out this one. I'll probably intentionally be avoiding any further beta tests or the early access myself so that I can get all of the surprises at once when the version 1.0 launches. Still, this is a very unique take on the extraction type game that feels less like Escape from Tarkov and more like a multiplayer Breath of the Wild. It's kind of everything I'm looking for in a fun little multiplayer game to play with Vi. I can absolutely see us sinking hours and hours into it as we jump from one expedition to the next, constantly grinding up to build every gadget and dominate every creature and locale as they are introduced. To the point that I've re-downloaded the original Astroneer in the meantime of making this video because I want to keep scratching that itch. Also, I never played the DLC my first time playing, and I need to correct that. Hey, it's that time again. The end of the video where I invite folks to come check out the Patreon. Link in the description, and make good on the rewards for those currently pledged. Patreon members get early access to new content and their names written in the credits at the end of videos. And those who pledge in the top tiers get their names read out, like our DevBox designers, Genghis Braun, and our DevBox developers, Azul. Thanks for your support, and thanks for watching.